everybody. Welcome, and thank you so much for joining us on today's Q&A Cafe. This is our project management series with Chris Hogan, creating and maintaining a project plan, part 1. As I mentioned, your host will be Chris Hogan, and I am Catherine, and I will be your facilitator as per usual. This webinar will be recorded, so please make sure that if you have any questions or comments that you type them into the questions or chat box, and we will get to them towards the end of the webinar. Don't forget to join us next week. We have our very first in our Business One bi-monthly series with our newest addition, Shannon Kennedy. She's from our acquisition with the Achieve ITS team there. That's going to be all about CRM in SAP Business One. You can register for that on social media or on our website as well. All right, so without further ado, I will hand it over to Chris.
All right, thanks, Catherine. Yeah, so as Catherine mentioned, we're going to go through this session here to go through project plan. And I call it part 1 because we're going to really take a look at one part of the project planning. So specifically, we're going to look at how you basically the project plan, the Gantt chart in the section where you would outline your work breakdown structure. And we're going to talk about the difference between tasks, milestones, phases. We'll go through the basic data tab on tasks, so you have an understanding of all the fields that are there, task statuses, and scheduling, and dependencies, and then work. What we're not going to cover is more of the materials, revenue, and expenses. We'll cover that in a future session, but really the intent of this session is to get you an understanding of the fundamentals around building out your work breakdown structure with the tasks. So we've got a lot to cover, so we're going to jump right into it. So we're logged into by design here, and where we're going to go is to our project management work center or search for it. So really quick, we can go and find projects, and the projects list is where we're going to start. Now, in the previous video, we have covered briefly how to create a new project. We're just going to go through that really quickly again, not spend a lot of time there because a lot of the fields that are part of that guided activity, we're going to talk about anyways, but we're just going to step through the new creation of a project. So you can do that from the work list here, the project management projects work list. There's also a shortcut, common tasks, new project. So if you were to instead, you could just down below type in new project and it'll bring up that link, or you could add it to your shortcuts and then you can quickly access it. Either way, we'll bring you to the same place, which is this guided activity to create a new project. So once you come into this screen, you're going to be asked what kind of project type you want to create. Now, out of the box, there's really 4 main project types, but you can define names for these different project types. And really what the project type governs is the accounting and also the workflow that that project's going to be used in the system. For our purposes today and what we're going to cover, really not that important in terms of what project type we pick. In previous videos, we've been going through the order to cash project scenario. So I'm just going to pick that to be consistent with what we have been going through previously and what we will continue to be going through in later sessions. But if this was a project that was not going to be a customer project with no sales orders, strictly internal, you could pick, for example, a cost collecting project for an internal project. So we're going to go ahead and pick the customer project with sales order integration. Now you're asked, where do you want to, do you want to pull and leverage some existing project data? So there's an option that you can copy details from a previous project. You could import from a Microsoft project plan, or you could use an SAP by design project template, which allows you to define in advance the basics of a project and use that. We're going to really actually just start with a project from scratch. And then the rest of the screens we're going to move through fairly quickly because these are the ones I was talking about. We're going to talk a bit more about these fields as we go through. So really just for right now, we'll give this a name. And so let's just give this is our project plan demo. And we'll say that it's going to start, we're going to say that it's going to start on the 1st of July. And it's going to run until, say, August 30th. In terms of, I'm just going to really cover the required fields here. So responsible unit is going to be the part of the company, the part of the organization that's going to be responsible for delivering, for executing this project. And so in your company, you'll have all kinds of organizational units. In this demo system, we're going to use PMO Pro. So we'll select that. And then I'm just going to pick, for the moment, to assign this to myself as a project manager. The rest of the stuff, we're just going to leave, and we're going to proceed to the next step. If you wanted to, you could start defining a team here. We're going to cover that in later sessions. So we're just really looking forward to move forward here, click finish, so that we can get that project created and start jumping into the work breakdown structure. So at the end of this guided activity, you'll be presented with a link that you can drill into open up that project. Now, when you first create a project, it's going to be created with an in planning status. And we'll talk about statuses a little bit later, but just so you're aware, we've got the beginnings of our project. It's in an in planning status. So where we're going to be spending the balance of the time here in the demo, like I mentioned, was around the project planning. So here is the project plan. We are going to define all the tasks, all the work to be done. We won't be spending any time on these other tabs, really. We're going to spend most of our time really around the Gantt chart. We're going to get an understanding of how we create these tasks. We're going to spend time talking to some of the aspects down here and how they relate to a task. All right. So really the first thing we should cover is, what does this row represent? So we've created the project, and that first row in this table represents the project itself, or the project header. Now you'll notice down below, it's got many of these tabs here that later, once we start adding tasks, those tasks in the project actually carry many of the same tabs. There's really only one sub tab here that's different, that you won't find as much information on additional tasks themselves. On the accounting tab here on the project header, there's a number of special fields here related to the project. So we've already seen one, which is the responsible unit. And so what that represents is, within our company, the organizational unit that'll be responsible for delivering the project. And that's also, you'll see, driving the company as well as the profit center for this project. If this was a project that's being delivered for a customer, you would see these fields down here. Now that's because on the project type, I had selected that this was a project with sales order integration. And so that's where we can specify that it's going to be a billable project for a particular customer. If this was a project that was strictly internal, and that was the type that we picked, like a cost collecting project, you wouldn't see any of this information shown. So here's where I would set the project customer. And so for example, we can say that we're going to be delivering this for the customer Silver Star, and set that here. The fields over here on the right are more for sales reporting. So they're going to be the same kind of reporting fields that you would see: customer group, product category, sales unit, sales region, like you would see on sales operational reports. So really that's just for strictly reporting purposes. So why I was calling out kind of this tab here on the project specifically is really mainly around this here, right? The responsible unit that's going to be driving the execution of the project, and the customer that we're going to be delivering this project for. When it comes to other tasks, you won't have the same kind of level of detail on the accounting tab, but all the other tabs really do come into play on subtasks. Now on that note, what we're going to go through today is going to go and explain how you can build out your project and break it down into a further structure, but you don't necessarily need to, because as you can see on this row here, we can go ahead and we can define the type of work that's going to be done. We can define materials, expenses, revenues, the scheduling. So if you've got a very, very simple project and there's no need to go and break down the structure, you can, in your system, just have this one row represent your project and do all of the assignments for people that will be doing the work, schedule the dates, really the start and end date. So what I'm trying to say is, we're going to go next to talk about how you would break down the tasks, but everything that we talk about there could also be applied just if you want to run your projects with a single task, essentially. Okay, so now let's go and talk about the tasks and the different types that are available in creating this work breakdown structure. So to add tasks, you would use this button here. And in the system, there's really 3 different types that you can add. So we're going to add all 3. So we'll add a task, and we'll add a phase, and we'll add a milestone. And you can see here that they carry different indicators. So this is our task. And this is our phase that we added. And this one here is our milestone. Now, in terms of being able to define work and record time and materials, recording all those actuals, in terms of what the system allows, really the only difference between these three things is that a milestone does not allow the recording of any time towards it. And it can also be used in invoicing to drive milestone invoicing. Other than that, time, you'll see here as we split between these different types, you'll see in tasks and phases that there's really no difference between the two. Where phases come into play is more for conceptually for you being able to define your project plan representing this as a phase. And in reporting, there's the ability to pull out things and categorize them and by phase. But other than that, in terms of the actual planning and recording, tasks and phases, really, there's not any real differentiator other than that. Just from a reporting perspective for phases and milestones, no actual recorded, and really drive the ability to be able to do milestone billing, which we're not going to cover now. In a future session, we would cover that. So that's really all you need to understand, at least in terms of the different types of tasks that we have available to us. So now let's go in and start talking about what are the basic data that you would define on a task. Just to keep things simple so that we don't get confused, I'm going to remove these two because I really just wanted you to understand the three types, but we're going to spend the bulk of our time talking about tasks now. So I'm going to remove the milestone and I'm going to remove the phase. And we're going to spend time now talking about this task. So the first area to understand is basic data. What kind of information is this gathering and collecting and that we're putting into the system? So you got the project task ID. You'll see that that's all being driven by the got auto-generated number and then a suffix to the tasks. If you wanted to, you could change this, but there's really no need to. As you add more tasks, it's going to auto-number them. If you wanted to, again, I mean, you can certainly do that. Just creates a little bit more work for yourself to maintain all those task IDs. Task name is going to represent the type of work to be done. It's indicative to you of the type of work to be done. Duration is going to be the time between the start and the finish date for how long this task is going to elapse. If while we're building out our project plan, we happen to have added a task and really intended that it should have been a phase or a milestone, that's where here you can toggle and change that type of task. Person responsible is one where you can indicate at a task level, you could think of the person responsible, not really who's doing the work, but who should be overseeing the work. Now, we actually don't see clients using this very much at the task level. The one that's defined here at the project level is very important. That's the project manager. So you'll see here on the basic data for the project itself that the project manager is Eddie Smoke. Eddie Smoke, the project manager, is the one who's going to receive all the approvals for expense reports and time entered, everything like that. It would only be if Eddie wanted to designate somebody as a lead of a particular task that they could put it in here. But from a functional perspective, it's really Eddie Smoke that's going to be, like I mentioned, responsible for doing all the reviews and approvals of the actuals that are coming in. On the task itself, if there's going to be time that's entered, you can indicate to the system whether that time needs to be approved by the project manager, or it can directly go in without approval, or whether there should be no time allowed actually recorded against that task. So that's what those represent. The work description here is controlling when somebody records time against that task, whether the system will force them to put in a description of the work that was done. So it's a text box essentially on their time entry. So if you wanted to just allow people to put time in and not require any descriptions, you would pick the first option. If you wanted to enforce that they always had a description accompanying the time that they were logging, you would pick the second option. Expense reports allowed is indicating whether or not expense reports, if you're using the expense reimbursement functionality within SAP by design, would allow when somebody is entering that expense report for them to select and code an expense item to this particular task. I'll skip over, so I won't talk to this. That's just an extension field, a custom field that was added into the system, so I won't speak to that one. We'll come over here, we'll talk about statuses. So you'll notice all of our project header and task so far is an in planning status, and that's because that's the first status that a task, or sorry, a project is created in. While you have your project in an in planning status, every single task that you add subsequently is going to be added. You'll see that with an in planning status. Being the very first status, it's special in the sense that you can maintain all those statuses in planning. What we'll see at the very end, once we've kind of built out our project plan here, I will progress the status and we'll say that we're going to release it. It's ready for the team to start delivering on it. Once we've done that, we'll see how the system goes and updates all the statuses to released. And from that point on, once the project is released, any new tasks that you add in will always carry that released status going forward. There's no ability to do any more additions from a planning status perspective. You can really only maintain those planned statuses while the whole project is in planning. And really what that means is that only the project manager at this point is really seeing the project, defining the project. Nobody else in the system from a time entry or anything like that perspective is even seeing the project. So carrying on just with some of the other basic fields here. So kind of related to statuses is the on hold indicator. So it could be that we've got the task that we're doing work on, we've got it released, but for a particular reason, we just want to put pause, not allow any further time to be entered, not allow any materials to be consumed. We can use this indicator to essentially put a block on any further entry of actuals against that task. And then later, when it makes sense, we can remove that block. The estimated percent of completion would be utilized for reporting purposes for projects where you're going to run those by estimated percent complete. And then the rest of the fields down here around priority and risk are more just kind of statuses, indicators on the task itself. Doesn't really drive a whole lot of functionality. The mail notification one is a little bit confusing, and it does drive email notifications, but not necessarily the ones that you might think. Really what it has to do is it has to do with if somebody who's working on the project as a team member goes and self-assigns themselves to a task, and there's a way for them that they could do that, it would notify whoever is designated as a person responsible that somebody's done that. So it's not, it's really meant to give notification to the project manager that somebody's self-assigned them to a task, and that's really all that it's intended to do. So that's essentially what you need to understand, I guess, just from the basics of a task. What we're going to go into next is actually going over how to add tasks, and then as we've kind of built out these tasks, then we'll jump forward into explaining more around the scheduling and the dependencies from like a timeline and scheduling perspective. Okay, so with that, we're going to spend our time now up in this table. So we've already seen how we've added one task, and you add that using this add button. We've already seen how you delete. That was using the delete button. So it's really just a matter of selecting the row that you want and deleting. So if I want to go ahead and just add a couple more tasks in here, I can do that just by clicking the add button. And we'll give these some names just as we're going through this, things make a little bit more sense for us. So let's just say we're going to be doing, we're going to be developing just, a smartphone app or something like that. So let's go and say that we're going to have to do some requirements gathering, and then we're going to have to do some analysis and some design and some coding. And then we've got some testing and deployment that we'll have to do. So I'll go ahead and just add those other two tasks here. And you can see that that's actually a good thing. It popped them into, I'll just get that typed in there. So it popped it into the middle of the group, which is a good thing. We'll show you how to reorganize those tasks. So as I was adding these, you can see that auto numbering is being done here. If you wanted to, you can go again, right? You can go and change these numbers to what you want to, but it's just as fine to leave them auto numbered. In terms of now rearranging, so we've kind of seen how we add and delete. If you want to rearrange, it's these buttons over here. So for example, coding, just logically as we're looking at our, oh, sorry, I've got two of them in there. So we're going to do requirements, we're going to do analysis. So we'll push that one up. We've got design that we're going to do next. So we'll push that one up there. Oh, I see what we missed. It was testing. This should be that we're going to perform some testing. So really the coding should come before the testing, and the deployment would be the very last thing that we'll do. So that's kind of good because you got to see how we use these buttons here to rearrange the order of the tasks. Just while we're going through this, I'm going to save my changes. Kind of do that as we go all along the way. Now, we've seen here how we can create the tasks. We've seen how we can move them up and down. The duration now is the next thing that we should look at in terms of specifying how long this work is going to take. So let's just say, for example, it's going to take us 5 days to do the requirements gathering, 5 days to do the analysis. The design might take us more like 10 days, and then the coding, maybe that's going to take us 15 days. You can see as I'm doing this, the system's updating the graphical representation of our work breakdown structure in the Gantt chart over here. So we'll just finish fleshing this out here. The testing maybe is going to take 10 days, and then the deployment, once everything's been tested and done, really shouldn't take that long. Now, you can see as I've done the duration, right, I kind of specified here through these tasks, so what's going to be done. I'm specifying here the overall duration elapsed time of what it's going to take, but the system's assuming that it is all starting on the beginning of the project. And if we don't tell the system any further, that is the assumption that it's making. It's assuming that every task defined here is going to have the same start date as the project itself. And that start date of the project is up here. If we go back to the project header row itself, where you would maintain that if it happened that it wasn't going to be July 1st and you're planning this out, instead it's going to be a little bit later, over in the scheduling tab is where you're going to find all the date related information for the project itself or even tasks. So this is where, if we wanted to change the start date of the project or the end date if it was going to be fixed, that we would maintain that. So we can see here that it's assuming everything's starting at the beginning of the project. That would be true of requirements, but not really true of the other parts of the project that we have to do here. So that's where the dependencies are going to be helpful in taking these tasks and really, ordering them over the lifespan of the project. So for example, we know that analysis is going to be something that has to be done after requirements is done. So how you would maintain that or tell the system that is over here using the dependencies tab. And you can go ahead and you can add rows saying that this analysis is going to be coming after the requirements. So you can use this table essentially to do that. However, a quicker, easier way that you can also do that is actually on the graph itself here. So you'll see as I hover over these tasks, my cursor changes. And when it comes into that crosshairs, I can now click down with my mouse, and as I start drawing, there's a little arrow that comes. And basically what I'm saying here is that requirements task, I'm going to point to the one that comes after. And once I drop that onto the analysis, now what it's done for me is over on requirements, it's created a dependency. Instead of me having to do it manually, just me drawing it out is told the system now that essentially after the requirements task here finishes, then the next task to start is going to be the analysis. So really quickly, I can do the same thing here. I can go over analysis and say, well, after the analysis is done, then would be the design. And after the design is done, then would be the coding. And then after the coding is done, then would be the testing. And finally, after the testing is done over here, then I can draw that one over to the deployment, and that's when the deployment will be done. So as I scroll this over now you can see based on the durations, right, that I entered for these tasks and the dependencies, it's plotted out now really what's going to happen over the life of the project. I'll save those changes. Now, if for whatever reason, well, actually, no, let's just cover a little bit more on dependencies. So this is pretty, I guess, ideological that, everything's going to work exactly, the way that we've got here. If you needed to, for example, indicate that analysis, doesn't have to start exactly after requirements is done. Maybe it'll start a little bit sooner, maybe it'll start a little bit later. So you can control that with this field over here, which is the lag setting. So for example, on analysis, we could say that analysis actually could start up to 2 days sooner. Oh, sorry, I got that wrong. I'm on the wrong one there. So we'll leave that and we'll say it's really on requirements. So once requirements are finished, then we can start on the analysis, but the analysis can start up to 2 days sooner. And that looks like it's not updating. And then let's just go back on the analysis and see, I see why. I will remove this and then I'll let you know what happened there. So just to come back to what we were talking about with the requirements, over here, we were saying that the requirements, once they finish, then analysis is going to start, and it can start up to 2 days sooner. And so having done that, it's now moved in the analysis. And just to kind of see that again, we can just update. So that's really what we were expecting to happen there. I can do the same thing and say, well, you know what, the analysis really shouldn't start immediately after requirements. Maybe it starts 2 days later. So that's how you, on the dependencies, can control the overlapping of these tasks starting either sooner or either later. And we'll just save those changes. So that's how, using the dependencies, you can essentially order how these tasks are to be planned out and they'll run over the project. Now, there was that little kind of indicator that was on the task here that didn't allow the lag to shift. And so we'll just explain that right now. So the whole reason that we would use these dependencies is you can see that it plots out these tasks as they're to occur in sequence over the life of the project. And what's great about that is that as things change, either things take longer, right, as the duration increases, or as the schedule changes, then those changes will ripple and, you know, move the schedule for the tasks downstream. So for example, let's just say requirements is not going to take 5 days, it's going to take 10 days. So in doing that, you can see how it's now pushing out all of the other dependent tasks. In the same way, you know, if we were to shorten it, it would shorten it. Now, that's an example here where we're updating that the duration itself, the elapsed time of these tasks is changing and how that updates the project plan. The other thing that could happen is it might be that this task has to start at a specific date. So that little arrow indicator that we had seen really is a constraint, a start date constraint that was put on. And so when we go and look at the scheduling here, I had cleared out this date field here. You can use these dates to say that a specific task has to either start or finish as well on a particular date, and you can control what type of constraint that's going to be. You can also, and this is what happened when we were just demonstrating it, you can also do that graphically. So when you have to be really careful when you're using the graphical portion here to make sure that when you're adding a dependency, for example, you click down and drag the arrow. If you click down on the task itself and you move it, really what you're saying to the system is you want to add a start constraint. So it went and it added that little arrow at the beginning, and we'll be able to confirm that by seeing now here, it went and it added that start date constraint, because we're saying that we want to move that task to start at a particular time. That's how it understands when you're moving the tasks left to right in the Gantt chart. So that's one that often kind of users get caught up on. If that happens to you, no problem. You don't want to start constraint, you can just select that and remove it, and then things will go back to how you expected. You can also change the duration. Oh, let's see there, it happened again to me. So it's very, very sensitive. You can also control the duration here, either by, like you've seen me do, changing it in here, or you can also, once you've got your mouse indicator at the very edge of the task, you can shorten or lengthen the task here, and it'll update the duration accordingly. So I think that kind of covers in terms of, you know, the creation of the tasks themselves, and it covers how you would then sequence the tasks and use the dependencies to create that sequence, and the lag to either have tasks start a little bit sooner, a little bit later than others that are dependent, and also use the constraint dates to fix a particular start or finish time for tasks. So what we should go into now is talking, actually, let's just finish out. One thing I didn't show you is, I was gonna go next to defining, you know, the work to be done, but what we should just talk about next is, I've only really shown you how to define the work breakdown structure so far at one level. That may be enough depending on the type of project and the complexity of the project, or you may want to break it down even further. And so how you would do that is the same way that we've seen in terms of adding tasks, but let's just say I wanted to break down the requirements even further. So I can add a task here, but I would use the indentation functionality now here to move this in, and this now becomes essentially a subtask of requirements, breaking down the work to be done for requirements. So let's just say, for example, that we need to go and we need to conduct interviews. That would be one thing. Another thing we might need to do is, after we've done the interviews, is we need to do some write-ups. So I can go and I can continue, adding tasks one by one like I have. Or another thing that we can do is, and let's just say, well, what we use is this copy functionality. So I wanted to show you this. So it may be, if you've got a lot of tasks and you've got their settings all defined and you want to create a similar task but give it a different name for different work that'll be done, you can use the copy functionality here. So once you've got that particular task selected, you can copy it. Now you just need to be careful in terms of the paste, that you're going to be pasting it into the right place. And the way the system understands it is it wants you to select what the places you want to paste it in. So we're going to select requirements, and we go back here, we want to paste under that parent row that we've selected, which is requirements. And so now we've got a copy of the interviews, and we can change this one to be our write-ups. As we've done that, what you'll notice is that as you start breaking down and using the subtasks functionality, so this is now on the, I guess what I would say, the second indentation level. So this would be the first indentation of tasks, the second indentation would be the subtasks. So you can see here, this now is expandable and collapsible to show those tasks. Now, you might wonder, so this requirements, it kind of becomes like a summary task. And you might wonder, well, what does that mean when I add these subtasks under requirements? Does that mean that this really no longer allows me to record time and materials against it, only record against these ones? And the answer is it depends. And it depends really on how you've configured the requirements task. If you really only want the requirements task to represent purely a summary and have no time or actuals recorded specifically against it, that's where on the basic data tab, you'd need to make sure that you set it up so that there's no time recording allowed, and there's no expenses allowed. And then in that way, it would serve purely as a summary task from like a roll-up perspective. And you'd want to make sure that on the ones where you're expecting the actuals to be recorded, that in their basic data, you've set those accordingly to allow time entry. In this case, it's just going to be allowed, no approval required. And this one, no work description, and we're allowing expense reports. So you can have summary tasks where they're purely summary, or you can still leave them open to accept actuals as well. And it all depends on how you set the project up and want to run it that way. The other thing you'll notice is that once I've created these subtasks, I'm no longer defining the duration of the summary task itself, and that's because it's being calculated now based off of the duration of the underlying subtasks. So we'll see here, as we enter that in, we've got two tasks, 2 and 3, and it's going to be taking the total duration of those. And if we scroll back, you may wonder, like, why is that 5? And that again comes down to, we'll just save this here. That again comes down to, we'll see the overall duration of the summary task itself is 3 days. But because I haven't defined any dependencies or any constraints start dates on those two subtasks, it's understanding that so far these two things could be done in parallel, and therefore the overall duration of the requirements is 3 days. So following the same kind of dependencies and what we've already covered, you could further define that and get this to span out into 5 days if it's true that these should happen in sequence, not in parallel. Okay, so we've covered essentially the basics of going and understanding the basics around basic data for tasks, and the basics around scheduling, and the basics around dependencies. What I was going to go into next is defining from a services perspective, work to be defined, work to be done, because all we've really said so far is that we've got these tasks to be done. So what is the work to be done? how long is it expected to take from a duration perspective, over what time frame. That's essentially what we've defined so far. But within these, tasks, like requirements, who's going to be doing the work, and how much time are we planning for them to be able to do that work? That's where the work tab comes into play. So let's go and define on the interviews task, for example, make assignments here for who should be doing that work. So on the work tab, there's really a couple things here to understand that are the most key elements of this. And really what that is that we're going to assign to this task a particular service to be done by a particular team member to be done. And then we're going to define how much work we're allotting for them to do it. The rest of the stuff in here is not required in terms of these dates. And this stuff here will just be calculated. So let's go, for example, and say, now the services that are in here may not be exactly representative, but let's just go and say that it's going to be a, I think there's like consultant team there, probably some, it doesn't really matter. Like, just imagine this is a consultant of some kind or a developer. So this service represents the type of work to be done. So we've got an engineer that's going to go and do some interviews. Now, if we're planning out this project and we don't yet know quite who is going to be doing it, that's totally fine. We can leave that and assign that later. All we need to know is what's the type of work to be done and how many hours are we expecting that work to take. So let's just say that the interviews themselves are going to take probably 12 hours for all of the people that need to go through the interviews. And then we realize, well, you know what, it's not just going to be one engineer, there's probably two people that are conducting interviews. So we'll go ahead and add a second one, and maybe this is going to be actually somebody who's more senior. So between the two of them, they are going to spend probably 6 hours each, actually, now that we're realizing it. So if I save my changes there, here what we're telling the system is these interviews, that work itself that's going to elapse over the course of 2 days is going to be 12 hours of effort, and it's going to be done by two particular people. And this is the skill, the service essentially that we require. At this time, we don't know exactly who, so we're leaving the team member blank. And that's essentially how you would define the work to be done. Once you do know the specific person that's going to be doing the work, then you would be able to come in and assign that person. So we'll just say, for example, Iris is going to be the one that'll be doing the engineer, and Peter is going to be the one who's going to be doing the one who'll be overseeing it from a supervisor perspective. Once I've made these assignments is where, depending on the project status, these folks will start to see these tasks in their timesheets. All of this that we're doing right now is purely from an in-planning perspective, so they would not see anything in their timesheets at this point, but I can stage this all. If I know that it's going to be these folks that are doing this work, I can get this all prepped and planned for the very beginning to kick off the project. And then once I release the project for execution, then that's when Iris would see this task interviews in her timesheet with this particular service, really making it easy for her to start entering her time, the actual time, against the planned work of 6 hours. So wanted to cover the basics of planning out the work. You would be able to do the same across all the other tasks. There's a couple different views on the project in terms of work and planned work and team members. We'll see that in a future session more around the team and staffing, which gives you some different views. But in terms of how you would assign folks to tasks and define the work to do, that's all controlled under the task itself, each task under this work section. There was two other things kind of wanted to cover just on tasks, which is checklists and attachments. And then we'll, like I said, we'll flip the project itself over to release, because I kind of want to just finish out by covering the task statuses, and then we'll open it up for questions. So on any particular task, there is also the ability to add checklists and attachments. Now, checklist is not it could be useful functionality for you, but it kind of depends. Really, what this is you can define on each task one or more checklists. So this would be, for example, checklist 1, and within this checklist, we can define particular items that would need to be completed before it would reflect that the overall checklist on this particular task is done. So it kind of really depends on your use case. If you've got maybe like a certain number of steps from a verification that need to be done, or maybe you want to be able to have on here certain steps of just from, here's all the things we need to make sure we cover in the interview. It's really kind of open-ended in terms of how you could use these checklists, but and so you would define them. And once once those things have been done, then it's up to essentially the project manager to come and update the checklist, indicating that these are no longer open items. They've now been cleared, they're okay, or maybe they're not relevant anymore. And as you do that on the individual items, then you'll see that the checklist itself is cleared, completed. Okay is the indicator that it uses for that. So the functionality here is kind of basic, but maybe it's helpful depending on your use case. Also on tasks are attachments. So you can add attachments to any individual tasks, and same for checklists. So everything that we're talking about, checklists and attachments, you can do on any one of the tasks. You can also do them on the project header. In terms of the project, the attachments, so just like anywhere else you would see in by design, like on a sales or something like that, you can add a file or a link. So for example, if we wanted to add to this, maybe the list of questions or maybe some materials that would help brief the team that's doing the interviews, we can go ahead and use the attachment functionality here. And you can use the button to browse into your file system, or you can even just drag and drop. So I'm going to drag and drop Word document, for example. And if I drop it on the drop here, you'll see that it takes that document. And then I'm going to go ahead and do the same. I'll add a second one. And this one here, I'm going to just drag over document number 2 and drop it here. And if you've used the attachments in by design, so PDFs, images, docs, all that kind of stuff, you can attach. All of it works the same here. The only reason I really wanted to show you this on the project perspective is just to come back and show you where, like, the view of attachments. So here you've seen me add these to an individual task, but a nice kind of thing just in terms of looking at attachments as a whole on the project is if you come over here on the project overview tab and you go to attachments, here's where you're going to see a list of all the attachments that have ever been added to the project, and it'll tell you on which specific task they've been added, and then which attachments. So that may be an easier way for you to find specific attachments you're looking for, rather than hunting and pecking kind of through every single task. Use this one here, which gives you a quick glance across all the attachments. All right. So the last thing I wanted to finish out with was just the kind of a short discussion around the task statuses. So I'm going to take the project now that we've been working with in an in-planning status. Once we've got the project all planned out and we're ready for that project to be started and the team to start delivering, which SAP's terminology in the system and help documentation, you'll call it executing the project. That's where the project manager would take the project and move it from an in-planning status to started or started and released. Now, started essentially is really taking the project and just locking in the project code itself and making the project aware to the rest of the system from a finance perspective, but not an execution perspective. The release is where it does the full, let finances know. And when I say let finances, the other modules in the system. So it lets the finance modules know about the project, locks in the project code, but the release functionality then opens it up and allows people to start seeing those tasks in their timesheet, recording time in their timesheet, as long as we've assigned them to those tasks. So I'm going to go ahead and do start and release, and you're going to notice something that happens here. So the released is what SAP calls kind of a propagating status change. And so what that means is as soon as we put the project into released, it's going to propagate that status down across all of the tasks. And that's a good thing. So we want to start releasing for execution. The in-planning status, once we've done that, you'll see we can no longer go back to an in-planning status. So really, once you take your project from in-planning to either started or in released, your project codes are locked in, and essentially you're on a go-forward basis, and you have new statuses now to control the life cycle of the project or individual tasks. So those statuses are available, like I mentioned, on the project itself or on a task. And once you've got the release, what that really represents is this is an active task. We've already talked about the hold indicator, and I want to talk about that again just a little bit now in relation to these statuses, because it's important to understand. If this is a task, let's just say the write-ups. So we're doing the interviews, and we've got the write-ups released. We know that the write-ups are going to be starting according to our project plan at some later point in time. If we wanted to make sure that nobody was going to actually be delivering on any of this, that's where you would use the on hold indicator. So the use case there is, even though this is a release task, it is work that's going to be done. We don't want to be using it right now. We want to actually prevent people from doing any recording of time against it. That's where the hold indicator would come in, and you'll see it grays it out here. And it does the same in people's timesheets. Once it becomes that there's, when you want to resume it, then you can take it off hold. Kind of related, but not exactly the same, is you could accomplish the same thing with the task statuses. You could use the stop status. However, in SAP's kind of terminology with their statuses, they also kind of mean the stop to mean, stop work and you're not going to do work anymore at all ever again on the task. It's not really like driving anything in the system from that perspective, but as you read the help documentation, that's the way it's all kind of phrased. Whereas, like if you were to be really stopping work and never doing it again, some people might think to use, the complete, but really SAP in terms of the way they phrase their documentation and the functionality is kind of like laid out and stuff like that in the system. Complete really means like, your work complete and the work is done. So the two statuses there in the hold indicator, they can be a little bit confusing if you don't really, have a firm understanding of them. But probably the safest thing to do is, once you want to start executing on a task, put it into release status. If you wanted to prevent people from further delivering on that, you can put it on hold, you can take it off. If you find that you're going to stop work and never have to resume it again, you would do stop. And once you've completed work, you can do complete. Now, I tell you all of that, none of those statuses are locked in. If you find that you stop work, you save changes, and then you're going to be resuming work later, you can come back and you can revoke the stopping, and it goes back to released. So none of that stuff is really baked in. The only one you really need to be paying attention to and be really sure of is where you're going to take your project from an in planning status and move it into a release status. Once you do that, everything's locked in from your task IDs perspective. But the rest of the statuses you're able to work with. So that was just more of wanting to explain I guess how similarly related, on hold, complete, and stop are, but kind of serve different purposes, different functions. So I'm going to end it there. We're going to open it up to questions. And with that, really the intent here was to give you, a dive into understanding how to work within the project plan area of the screen, specifically the Gantt chart, the different types of tasks that are created, the basic data that you need to tell the system what those tasks are, and then lay out essentially the order, the sequence of those tasks using scheduling and dependencies. And then finally, how you would then further define on those tasks the work to be done by which people and how many hours within that elapsed duration. So Catherine, I'm just gonna, I guess, end it there and we'll open it up for any questions.
Awesome. Yeah, I see a couple here. So I'm just going to go from the top there, and I apologize if you did already cover that, Chris.
Sure.
But we've got one here. Is the project header level the only level to put a customer number?
Great question. Yeah, so when you have a project that is going to be a project that is delivered to a customer, there's two types of project types in the system. One is going to be your customer project with sales order integration, or the other is a direct cost project. It's only those two types of projects where only on the project header under the accounting tab that you would find the ability to define that customer. Yes.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much. I've got two more here. Next is there any location to enter in prime contract number, subcontract number, and or PO number other than in the description section?
That's a great question. So that kind of ties into, well, so I'll answer that by kind of, it depends. It depends on which type of project you are using to represent that in the system. Why I say that is, If you are using the type of project that's sales order with integration, customer project with sales order integration, it's the sales order that really represents the contract, the deal that was done and what was sold to the customer. And it's the project itself that takes that and breaks down that work, records the actuals. And when those actuals are done, project invoicing then leverages also information on the sales order to produce the invoice. Now, why I'm saying all of that is when you're using that type of project where there's a sales order and a project linked together, those customer type reference numbers, where like a PO number, an AFE number, that like an authorization for expenditure, I mean, those get defined on the sales order. And then when the project invoicing runs, it'll pick those up and push them all the way through to invoicing. So if you're using that type of project and functionality in the system, really you would want to define those on the sales order. If you're not using that, then on the project itself, there's not really an area for that, but you could, for your own internal purposes, add an extension, what we call an extension field in by design, which is just a fancy way of saying, custom field. So that can be added by a user who's got the right level of access to make those kinds of, we call them adaptations to the screens. You can add those fields in. So an example was, I saw there was one in here for actually, like this here is an extension field that was added as a checkbox. There was one I saw that, and I'm missing it now, but you can add, for example, another text field here where you could put in numbers. There was one more question, I think you said, Catherine?
Oh, yes. Sorry, I was on mute there. All right, so last question here. How long of a duration can a project be?
I'm going to answer that by saying I'm not sure I've seen a duration that the system doesn't handle. So you can certainly you can have projects that are running multi-years. So for example, at VistaView Solutions, we've got long-running support projects that are set up in the system to run 5, 10 years. And so I've not really seen a duration that, or a limit, I guess, in terms of how the duration that the project can handle. But that's something that we could chase down and follow up maybe with a post to the YouTube video once it's posted. Yeah, I don't know, but there actually is a limit.
Awesome. Okay, fabulous. Well, I don't see any other questions there, so I think we're good to end there, Chris.
Great, thanks very much.
Awesome. Well, thank you all so much for joining us today. Again, this session has been recorded, so we will be sending that out within a couple of days. And as Chris mentioned, don't forget to check out our YouTube channel where we'll be posting updates as well. Don't forget to join us again. Just a quick reminder, next week, that is July the 7th already, and that's going to be our CRM and SAP business one. Huge thanks to Chris, another fantastic cafe, and huge thanks to you guys for spending your lunch hour with us.